Most people think memory is like a hard drive. Wrong. Forensic scientists know better. They treat memory like a crime scene itself, and that's why they remember details that would slip through your brain like water through a sieve. In 1984, a man named Ronald Cotton was convicted of rape based on eyewitness testimony. The victim was certain. Absolutely certain. She picked him out of a lineup. She testified. Cotton spent 11 years in prison before DNA evidence proved his innocence. The witness didn't lie. She genuinely believed what she remembered. Her brain had betrayed her. And nobody taught her the one technique that could have stopped it. Forensic investigators don't suffer from this problem. They can reconstruct a crime scene from memory with surgical precision. Not because they have better brains, but because they use a system that schools never teach. It's called elaborative encoding combined with context reinstatement, and once you understand why it works, you'll realize how badly you've been wasting your memory your entire life. Here's what the average student does. They read a textbook. They highlight it. Maybe they reread it twice. Their brain touches the information once, maybe twice, and they expect it to stick. It doesn't. Most of it evaporates within 24 hours. Ebbinghaus proved this in 1885 with his forgetting curve. He showed that without reinforcement, you lose 50% of new information within one day. Within a week, you're down to 30%. It's brutal. It's relentless. And it's completely predictable. But here's where most learners get it wrong. They think more reading equals better memory. Wrong. Cal Newport at Georgetown studied deep work. He found that passive re-exposure to material does almost nothing for long-term retention. Your brain doesn't care if you've seen something before. It cares whether you've engaged with it in a way that forces your brain to reconstruct meaning. Forensic scientists learned this from Ron Geiselman and Edward Fisher at UCLA. They developed the cognitive interview technique in the 1980s, and it became the gold standard for extracting memories from witnesses. And their method isn't magical. It's based on one core principle discovered by Endel Tulving called the Encoding-specificity principle. It says this: your memory isn't one filing cabinet. It's thousands of filing cabinets, each locked to the context where you encoded the information. If you want to remember something, you have to recreate that context during retrieval. This is Chapter 1. Context binds memory to reality. When a forensic investigator interviews a witness to a crime, they don't sit them down in a bright interrogation room and ask rapid-fire questions. Wrong approach. Instead, they take the witness back to the location. They have the witness close their eyes. They walk them through the scene step by step. They ask them to describe the smells, the sounds, the temperature, the other people in the room. They're not asking for more detail. They're rebuilding the mental architecture where the memory was stored. This is elaborative encoding. It's the opposite of passive reading. A study by Roediger and Karpicke published in Make It Stick showed that students who engaged in what's called retrieval practice, actively pulling information from memory and associating it with new context, retained 60% more information after 1 week than students who restudied the material 5 times over. Here's a concrete example. If you're learning Spanish vocabulary, the average person does this. They see the word. They read the translation. They move on. They forget it. A forensic level learner does this instead. They see the word and immediately imagine themselves in a scene where they would use it. They connect it to something emotionally vivid, something they've witnessed, something that has texture and smell and sound. That's elaboration. That's encoding specificity. The word doesn't live in an abstract dictionary. It lives in a reconstructed experience. A study by Gordon Bauer at Stanford showed that students who learned vocabulary by constructing vivid mental images of the words in action remembered 85% of the material 24 hours later. Students who just repeated the words remembered 36%. The difference isn't small. It's massive. And it's because your brain doesn't store abstract information efficiently. It stores experiences. But here's the problem though. Most people think they're doing this already. They think they're engaging deeply because they're highlighting or taking notes. Wrong. Notes are useless unless they're interrogative. They need to be questions. They need to force you to reconstruct. Forensic investigators don't take passive notes. They ask themselves questions during the interview. Where was the suspect standing in relation to the door? What color was the light? What sounds were happening? They're forcing the witness to rebuild the scene from fragments, and in doing so, they're cementing it. This brings us to Chapter 2. Spacing and interleaving are how expertise gets built into bone. You think you can cram for a test. You think one intense study session is better than several short ones. Wrong. Joshua Foer, who won the USA Memory Championship, documented his own training in his book Moonwalking with Einstein. He didn't study for 8 hours one night. He studied for 30 to 40 minutes every single day for a year. He spaced his learning out. And when he competed, he won. This isn't accidental. Hermann Ebbinghaus showed in the 1800s that spacing repetitions over time produces retention curves that dwarf mass practice. But here's what forensic scientists understand that average students don't. Spacing isn't just about time between study sessions. It's about variability in how you engage with the material. Interleaving is the practice of mixing different types of problems or topics during study instead of blocking them together. A study by Roediger and Karpicke, the same researchers behind Make It Stick, showed that students who interleaved their practice solving different problem types on math tests improved their performance by 30 to 40% compared to students who blocked their practice. They solved more of the same problem type in a row, got comfortable, then switched. Interleaved learners faced a new problem type every time. Their brains had to work. And that work is where learning lives. Forensic investigators practice this constantly. They don't just interview witnesses about the same crime type over and over. They handle financial crime, then homicide, then theft. Each case type requires different pattern recognition. Each case forces their brain to rebuild its categorization of what matters. When they go back to financial crime 3 weeks later, they're not retrieving a memory of their last financial crime. They're rebuilding the framework from pieces. That reconstruction is what makes them experts. A study by Cornell and Bjork at UCLA showed that learners who studied images of paintings from different artists mixed together, rather than grouped by artists, recognized new paintings from those artists significantly better. They developed deeper understanding because they forced themselves to identify what made each artist distinct every single time. The spacing wasn't just time. The spacing was cognitive demand. Hit subscribe before you forget. We fix leaky brains here. This brings us to Chapter 3. Emotional tagging is the index that retrieves everything else. You think emotions cloud memory. You think clear, objective thinking produces better recall. Wrong. A forensic investigator interviewing a victim of a violent crime knows something that most therapists get wrong. The details that matter most are tagged with emotion. And they're worth retrieving, not avoiding. James McGaw at UC Irvine spent decades studying emotional memory. He showed that emotionally significant events create stronger, more retrievable memories because of a chemical called norepinephrine that floods the amygdala when you experience something important or dangerous. That chemical tags the memory. It marks it as important. It makes your brain treat it differently during storage. But here's the trick that average learners miss. You don't have to wait for something to be naturally emotional. You can create emotional encoding artificially. Forensic scientists do this all the time. When they're reconstructing a crime scene with a witness, they don't ask neutral questions. They ask questions that reactivate the emotional state of the memory. They might ask, "What were you feeling when you saw the suspect?" They're not pursuing the emotion for therapy. They're pursuing it because it's the retrieval cue. The emotion is the index that lets the brain find everything stored near it. A study by Sharot and Phelps at NYU showed that memories encoded with emotional context were recalled with 50 to 70% better accuracy 1 week later compared to neutral memories. But there's more. The emotions weren't just helping the learners remember the emotional parts. The surrounding details came back too. The emotional tag was like a beacon. Everything near it in memory got illuminated. Here's how to use this. When you're learning something you need to remember deeply, don't learn it neutrally. Create a small emotional stakes for it. If you're learning a language, don't learn vocabulary isolated. Learn it by imagining a scenario where using the wrong word would be embarrassing. If you're learning history, don't memorize dates. Connect the date to a human consequence. Someone's life changed. Someone died. Someone was freed. The emotion doesn't have to be huge. It just has to be present. And when you need to retrieve the information, that emotional tag becomes the path your brain follows to find it. Another layer. Forensic investigators use a technique called context reinstatement, where they ask the witness to mentally recreate not just the visual scene but the emotional tone. What was the mood in the room? Was it tense? Calm? Chaotic? They're rebuilding the effective architecture. And when they do, the details come flooding back because the emotion is the skeleton key. But here's the problem though. Most people think emotional learning is unprofessional. They think it's irrational. Wrong. Anders Ericsson, who studied elite performers across chess, music, and sports for over 40 years, showed that the highest performers consistently use emotional investment as a learning tool. They care deeply about improving. They feel frustration when they fail. They experience satisfaction when they succeed. That emotional engagement is not separate from skill building. It's the fuel that makes skill building possible. This brings us to Chapter 4. Retrieval practice must be harder than encoding, not easier. You think practicing under comfortable conditions makes you learn better. Wrong. You think doing the same problem type 20 times is more effective than doing 5 different problem types once each. Wrong on that too. And you definitely think that looking at your notes right before a test is studying. Criminally wrong. Forensic scientists use a principle called desirable difficulty. When they train a new investigator, they don't start them on simple cases. They throw them into complex ones with missing information. They force the new investigator to reconstruct incomplete crime scenes. They ask them to connect details across multiple sources. They're making retrieval hard because hard retrieval is where learning actually happens. Henry Roediger and Roediger Karpicke, the researchers behind Make It Stick, ran a landmark study where students either restudied material or took practice tests on the same material. The resters felt more confident immediately after studying. They performed better on a test given right after. But 1 week later, the test takers crushed them. The test takers remembered 50% more information. Why? Because retrieval practice forces your brain to reconstruct from memory rather than recognize from a page. Reconstruction is stronger than recognition. It's also harder. It's also what matters. A related study by Bjork and Bjork, the retrieval-induced learning theory, showed something even stranger. When students were forced to wait longer between learning and retrieval practice, they performed worse on that immediate retrieval task. But their long-term retention was dramatically better. The struggle during retrieval is the signal to your brain that the information is important. Easy retrieval means your brain assumes you'll look it up again later. Hard retrieval means your brain locks it in because you might need to generate it from scratch next time. Here's how forensic teams train. They don't quiz trainees on crime scenes they just studied. They quiz them days or weeks later. They remove the notes. They ask them to reconstruct from memory. And the trainees hate it. They perform poorly on those quizzes. But 6 months later, when they're handling real cases, they remember those training scenes with clarity that doesn't fade. That's because the difficulty during retrieval encoded it as essential. The mistake most students make is they optimize for short-term performance on a practice quiz right after studying. They read the notes. They take a practice test while the material is still in working memory. They get 90%. They feel confident. Then the real test hits 1 week later, and they've forgotten most of it because that short-term retrieval was too easy. Your brain never got the signal to store it long-term. Forensic investigators solve this by making their retrieval practice intentionally difficult. They use what's called spacing with difficulty. Long delays between learning and testing. Multiple forms of the same concept mixed together. Questions that require synthesis, not just recall. A witness to a crime isn't asked, describe the suspect. They're asked, compare the suspect to the person you saw in the bank 3 months ago. Were they the same height? Same build? How would the lighting be different between the crime scene and the bank? The investigator is forcing the witness to retrieve the memory not as a single intact file but as pieces that have to be reconstructed and compared. A study by Dunlosky and colleagues published in Psychological Bulletin in 2013 reviewed over 300 studies on learning techniques. They ranked retrieval practice and spacing as the top two most effective study techniques. Everything else was ranked significantly lower. Highlighting, rereading, all the stuff you've been doing in school, ranked lower. Retrieval practice and spacing are the forensic weapons, and they're available to anyone. This brings us to Chapter 5. Metacognition is the difference between false confidence and actual competence. You think you know what you know? You're wrong. This is so common that researchers call it the illusion of fluency. You read something once. It makes sense at the moment. You feel like you understand it. You close the book. And when you try to retrieve it from memory 4 days later, you can't. But you didn't know you couldn't. That's the illusion. Forensic investigators have to eliminate this illusion immediately. If they're wrong about what they remember, people go to prison for crimes they didn't commit. Ronald Cotton is still alive. He's still testifying against eyewitness testimony. But others weren't so lucky. Between 1989 and 2015, DNA exonerations showed that eyewitness misidentification was the leading cause of wrongful convictions. 70% of DNA exonerations involved eyewitness error. 70%. And most of those witnesses were completely confident. They had the illusion of fluency at the moment of testimony. This forced forensic scientists to develop metacognitive systems. Techniques for monitoring your own memory accuracy without relying on confidence. One technique is called source monitoring. When a witness recalls a detail, they don't just ask, "Do you remember this?" They ask, "Where did this detail come from? Are you remembering the person directly from the crime scene? Or are you remembering a photograph you saw later? Or are you remembering a conversation with another witness?" Because memory is contaminated by these sources constantly. You integrate them. You lose track of which version came from where. A study by Marcia Johnson at Yale on source monitoring confusion showed that people frequently misattribute the source of their memories. They remember a detail, but they remember it from the wrong source. And they're confident about it. Johnson developed a framework where people ask themselves specific questions to verify source. Did I actually see this with my own eyes? Or did I hear about it? The questions force you to introspect accurately instead of relying on confidence. Another metacognitive tool forensic teams use is called the confidence-accuracy relationship. They understand that confidence and accuracy are not tightly correlated. You can be very confident and very wrong. But there's a weak relationship in the other direction. Very high confidence combined with low error in retrieval can indicate accuracy. The way they track this is they have the witness rate their confidence on specific details, and then they test those details later. If the witness was highly confident about the suspect's height but less confident about their clothing, they pay more attention to the height detail in their investigation because that's where confidence aligns with likely accuracy. For learners, this means you need to replace the feeling of understanding with actual testing. Every time you think you understand something, you test yourself on it. Not a comfortable test where you can look at your notes. A hard test where you have to retrieve from memory. If you pass that hard retrieval, you have evidence that you actually understand. If you fail, you have evidence that you don't, and you can target your studying. Most students never do this. They study, they feel comfortable, and they call it done. Forensic investigators study, they test themselves under hard conditions, they see if the memory holds, and only then do they consider themselves competent. Research by Dunning and Kruger, often called the Dunning-Kruger effect, showed that people with low ability are often most confident in their abilities. The people who don't know are the most sure they know. But conversely, people with actual expertise tend to be more calibrated. They understand where their knowledge is weak. They understand the limits of what they remember. That calibration comes from constant retrieval practice under hard conditions where you find out immediately whether you actually knew something or just thought you did. This brings us to Chapter 6. Transfer of learning is the real test, not the grade on the test. You think learning something means you can apply it. Wrong. Transfer of learning is when you take a skill or fact learned in one context and apply it successfully in a different context. Most people never achieve it. Students memorize formulas for a math class and can't apply them to real engineering problems. They study history and can't see the patterns repeating in current events. They learn a language in a classroom and can't understand native speakers. They have the information, but they can't transfer it. Forensic scientists have to transfer constantly. They learn investigative techniques in training. But the next crime scene they work on has completely different conditions. Different location. Different victim. Different suspect. Different physical evidence. If they've only learned rigidly, they're helpless. So instead, they learn principles that transfer. Anders Ericsson, who spent his entire career studying how expertise develops, called this deliberate practice. Deliberate practice isn't just practice. It's practice with feedback focused on improving performance in the target domain. And the target domain is always transfer. Ericsson studied chess grandmasters and found that their training wasn't just playing chess. It was solving chess puzzles where they had to apply their knowledge to novel positions they'd never seen before. The practice context had to be varied enough that they couldn't just memorize solutions. They had to develop flexible knowledge that could transfer. For crime scene investigation, this means a forensic scientist doesn't just study one type of crime scene. They study diverse scenes. They practice reconstructing different scenarios. They're exposed to variations constantly. When they encounter their next real crime scene, their brain recognizes the underlying patterns, not the surface details. They transfer their knowledge successfully. A study by Gentner and Medina at Northwestern University found that transfer of learning increases dramatically when the learner encounters multiple examples of the same underlying principle in varied contexts. Students who saw 3 different math problem types all solved using the same principle transferred that principle to novel problem types. Students who practiced extensively on one problem type did not. The variety in encoding is what creates flexible knowledge that transfers. This is the final weapon forensic scientists use that schools never teach you. When you're learning anything, you don't learn by going deep on one example. You learn by going wide across multiple contexts, all encoding the same underlying principle. Then when you face a novel situation in real life, your brain recognizes the principle and transfers the solution. But here's the problem though. Transfer is invisible until you need it. A student can study for a class and get an A without transferring anything. They memorize the exact problems they studied. The test is similar. They do well. Then they leave the class and never use the skill again. They think they learned. They didn't. They experienced the illusion of learning because the retrieval context was similar to the encoding context. They never transferred. Forensic scientists know better because their job requires transfer every single time. They can't afford the illusion. Ronald Cotton's case wasn't unique. It was a preview of what happens when we trust memory without testing it against reality. The forensic investigators who work on modern cases understand that memory isn't reliable just because it feels confident. It's reliable only when it's been forged through elaborative encoding, spacing, retrieval practice under difficulty, emotional tagging, accurate metacognition, and transfer across varied contexts. This is why forensic experts remember details that would destroy an average person's brain. Not because they have better brains, but because they use systems that actually work. Now you know those systems. The question is whether you'll use them or just keep reading your notes and hoping it sticks. Most people will keep hoping. They'll keep forgetting. They'll keep getting crushed by people who use these techniques. That's why I made the video breaking down how to build a personal spaced repetition system that works with the way your brain actually encodes memory. It's in the next video. Don't miss it.